to the first of 3 webinars from the Vacant to Vibrant program with EPA Region 9 and the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Today's session is focused on an introduction to brownfields, and we're going to be talking about starting, structuring, and navigating land reuse in your community. So this webinar is brought to you, in a sense, by the Vacant to Vibrant program, which I'll introduce further in a moment. And I wanted to emphasize that our main goal here is to connect with you all, to connect with folks that are new to the brownfield reuse. And we really hope that this webinar is a starting point for a connection with you, and that ultimately you'll schedule a meeting with our team to talk through the issues or goals that you have in your community. And we'll also be talking today about the basics of the land reuse process. So it will have a brownfield focus, but I wanted to say that the Vacant to Vibrant program is also about addressing all of the issues and goals that you may be, navigating or working towards. We are coming from the approach that everyone deserves access to clean air, clean water, and clean land, and each of these realms are highly connected when we're working on brownfields. So as we go through this, kind of be thinking about the connection that your community goals might have to land reuse as we go through the basics of the different components of land reuse. And we're really excited that all of you here are joining us, and we really look forward to connecting further with you during this session and also hopefully in a one-on-one Vacant to Vibrant meeting. And also for some housekeeping, of course, please keep your mic muted. We are in a webinar format, so you likely don't have the opportunity to turn your mic on, but just in case, wanted to put that there. And even though you can't unmute, you can still communicate with us in the chat box if you have comments, and also in the Q&A box if you have questions. So like I said, please put all your questions in that Q&A box that's on your bottom Zoom panel, because if you put questions in the chat, they might quickly get lost under comments, as I'll be asking for some input from you all in the chat. So we don't want to miss any questions. Please put them in the Q&A box. And we'll also answer all these questions at the end after our presentation. And if we don't get to any questions at the end, we will save all your questions and get back to you with answers in a follow-up email. Like I said, we'll kind of have some questions for you along the way. So please keep your Zoom window open to this webinar so that you can follow along with some of the questions that we have for you. So starting off, to kind of get us, let us get to know each other a little bit, I'd love to see who we have joining us today. Go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. You can say your name, where you're from, and what organization you're representing. And we would just love to see some of the folks that are here today. Awesome. Hi, Adam. Thanks for getting us started. And hi, Ella. Awesome. I love to see you all introducing yourselves in the chat. The chat is for engaging with us as well as your peers. So getting to know everyone is great. All right, so we go ahead and continue to share your introductions while I do some introductions on our end for our team. So my name is Devin Rainwater. I'm a program manager with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. We're also called CCLR for short. And I work closely with communities in regions 9 and also 10, and I'm based in Oakland, California. And so Brooklyn, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Brooklyn James. I am with the U.S. EPA Region 9 Brownfields team, and I'm a project officer. I focus on projects in Northern California, and our office is based out of San Francisco. I'll pass it to Stephanie.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon to some of you, it looks like. My name is Stephanie Steinbrecher. I am also with EPA's Region 9 Brownfields program. I'm a project officer, and I'm also based in our San Francisco office.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Brooklyn. And we also have Lisa Hanuziak here from EPA Region 9, and she'll be joining us during the Q&A portion to answer some questions as well. All right, so hopefully you guys, it's really great to see everyone saying hello in the chat. It's great to see that we have folks even from Guam. Thank you so much for joining. So it's great to see folks from all over Region 9 joining us. I'd also like to get to know each other a little bit more with a poll question. So you can go ahead and participate in this poll either by scanning the QR code on the screen, or you can join at menti.com with the code that's up at the top of the screen. And I'll also put the joining link in the chat just in case you prefer there. So you can join on your phone or on your browser. I would love to know, what is your general experience level with Brownfield programming and funding? I'd love to just see kind of the expertise that we have in the room today. Okay, awesome. I can see folks answering. So it looks like a fairly even split so far. Oh, thanks, Brooklyn. I'll make sure this link gets to everyone in the chat. There you go. There's the Menti join link for everyone. Okay, it looks like we have some folks that have worked closely with Brownfield funding and programming, as well as a lot of folks that have a lot to learn and are excited to learn. Sorry, the QR code is blocking that answer at the left there, but you should be able to see it on your browser. Okay, it looks like we've got a lot of beginners in the room. That's wonderful. We're really excited to connect with you. Okay, great. And now that you all have scanned this Menti code or joined on your browser, you will be able to follow along on the slides there. And then we will have further questions through Menti for you to engage with as we go along in the slides. So you can keep that tab open to follow along and answer at the future questions, but I'll also put the join link later on as well. So I'd also like to continue with our introductions and introduce the team at the Center for Creative Land Recycling, also known as CCLR. We are EPA's technical assistants to Brownfields or TAB provider for regions 9 and 10. And we are also partnered with EPA Region 9 in this Vacant to Vibrant outreach initiative. We work one-on-one with communities in our TAB TA to support their success throughout the land reuse process. And we're also working with communities that are new to Brownfield throughout the Vacant to Vibrant program. We work with folks throughout the reuse process, including project planning and visioning, and also identifying and accessing project funds. And this picture shows a handful of the lovely people at EPA. And I just would really love to give them all a shout out. This team is very passionate about supporting communities, navigating EPA funding and programming, and many of them are involved in the Vacant to Vibrant program and are excited to meet with you one-on-one as well. So I'd like to go over a little bit about what makes the Vacant to Vibrant initiative special, what our mission is. We really are dedicated to listening to clients, listening to you all first. Although we're going through and talking about the basics of Brownfields today, our overall mission, like I said, is to connect with you and start at your goals and hear about the issues that you're facing, whether they're focused on land or in the sky or anywhere in between the two. Our mission is primarily to listen and then work together to find the next steps towards meeting your goals. And oftentimes the issues that you are tackling are tied to land, and therefore Brownfield resources might be really helpful. And in support of that, we aim to get you a direct connection to EPA so you can work together to come to feasible solutions. So our priority, as you can see, our focus is to meet with communities and entities that have not yet partnered with CCLR or EPA. And we aim to work with sensitive communities that are facing issues such as extreme weather and low employment and may not have access to private funding. So again, our goal is to build a lasting connection with you and work with you all along your project to get you, to success. So here is how you can connect with us. You can scan this QR code to get a direct link to a spot on EPA's calendar. So this is an awesome resource. You can schedule a meeting to talk about your community's goals, issues, or priorities. And CCLR will also be there throughout the process to support you in building the connection and getting to solutions. I'll also put this information in the chat throughout the webinar so that you have access to this. And this slide also will come up again later too, just to really emphasize that we would love to meet with you. So I've hopefully done my job so far of introducing our goals with Vacant to Vibrant. So now we're going to get a little bit warmed up to talk through some basics of land reuse, because this will also be a training to kind of get you situated in the components of brownfields. And so we can start with what comes to mind when you think about brownfields. So you can scan this QR code or join at Menti and go ahead and write a few words, and it'll create a word cloud so we can kind of see what comes to mind when folks are thinking about these projects. Awesome. Thank you all for putting in your words. I'm seeing opportunity is remaining a huge word, so that's great. Redevelopment, liability, contaminated, vacant, connection, fun. That's awesome. I love to see that. Oil, hope, underutilized, waste, costly, possibilities. So we're kind of seeing a good mix here of hope and opportunity for what brownfield sites can become, and also understanding what they can start out as. That can feel harmful, contamination, it's a liability, toxic. Yeah, beneficial. Okay, that's great. So we can move on into kind of talking about a little bit more background on what brownfields are. So thank you for all your input. So it seems like some of you already have this understanding of what a brownfield might be. So a brownfield is any site in which the current or future use of the site is affected by real or perceived contamination, which poses a threat to human health and the environment. So typically these properties were previously used for commercial, industrial, or residential activities, and they can be vacant or they can contain buildings or structures on the site. The significant piece here is that brownfields only need to have perceived contamination for them to be eligible for brownfields funding or programming. So you really can tell a brownfield just by looking at it if there is perceived contamination there. Additionally, histories of redlining in this country have led to higher counts of brownfields in more sensitive, lower income communities. So that is where we're aiming our focus on those communities. So as I said, brownfield sites have typically been used before for any number of these uses and also much more. These sites can be sites of previous housing, gas stations, auto body shops, railroads, agriculture even, mining, and dry cleaners is on this list. That's a big one as well. And also can be sites of illegal dumping. So again, brownfields are sites of suspected contamination. So the sites or the uses that I just described are likely to leave behind contamination. And you can see that prior public and commercial use might lead to asbestos, petroleum, and more contaminants leaching into the soil. Industry and agriculture might leave behind toxic fuels and pesticides. And abandoned, empty sites may be vulnerable to illegal dumping, which can also lead to a whole host of contaminants. And unaddressed brownfields can also lead to challenges within the community where they are. Your community might even be facing some of the challenges listed here at the moment, and you can kind of connect them potentially to the existence of brownfields in your area. Brownfields might lead to issues such as sprawl, public health issues or concerns, decreased property value, low employment, and even a disrupted sense of community or even a lack of gathering space. And brownfields can also become opportunity sites. So like you said in the word cloud, opportunity, hope, and everything, it can be a big part of brownfield reuse. And it can address the issues that I just mentioned. If your region or community, for example, is at risk of flooding or fire or other extreme weather, brownfield reuse can support the development of resilient infrastructure. And if you're facing a shortage of affordable housing or a lack of public parks or shade, brownfield sites can become housing and also provide space for parks. And land cleanup also reduces the presence of contaminants and protects the health of residents in the area. Also on this list, jobs are created during and after the reuse process as well. So we have another word cloud for you all to participate in. And with all that information that I just went over about what brownfields are, I'm curious about what comes to mind for you when you think about analyzing your own community and starting a land reuse project in your community or with your organization. So you can go ahead and add 2 words. Again, you can join at menti.com and use that code. And I will also put the link in the chat again. All right, so we've got some folks adding in some words here. It's great to see that. Oh, I love that exciting is one of the first words. That's awesome and very positive. Revitalization, complicated is up there. Community benefits I'm seeing. Parks, funding is a big concern, cost. It's time intensive. I see gentrification is up there. That is awesome to be thinking about, especially early on in a project. It's really good to implement some anti-displacement measures early on. And also CCLR has a recent webinar about that. Useful redemption is a good word. Endless possibilities. Flood adaptation, so understanding resilient infrastructure, that's great. All right, so we can get more into some basics of the reuse process with that, and I'll pass it over to Brooklyn.
Awesome. Thank you, Devin. So as she mentioned, we are going to go in depth a little bit more about the basics of redevelopment. And we've kind of broken it down into these 5 phases that you see on the screen, starting with establishing a team and then developing inventory and selecting sites. Then we're going to talk more about conducting site assessments and due diligence and what that looks like. We'll go into reuse planning and visioning, and then also implementation of these strategies. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So when we think of a brownfields project, this is kind of what we hope for. This is the ideal trajectory of doing brownfields redevelopment. But a lot of times it looks more like what's on the next slide, where you might have to go up and down, back and forth, and upside down to get to your ultimate goal. And that's okay. That's pretty typical for the brownfields redevelopment process. So we're going to kind of go through what the steps are, and break it down, understanding that if you have to skip a step and go back or go out of order, that's totally normal. Next slide. So we're going to start with talking about establishing a team, but like I mentioned, and that's why we don't have these numbered, these can kind of be done out of order. So don't worry too much about that. So we will go into the next slide and talk about the importance of involving different stakeholders and partners in the very beginning and all throughout the process of the brownfields redevelopment. So it's really important to involve various types of stakeholders and partners in order to increase that feeling of community engagement as you're going through the project. It also can lead to, maybe you can stumble upon more funding opportunities just by engaging different organizations. Can also just increase your ability to tackle those roadblocks that you might encounter. You might have different perspectives, different point of views coming together to look at an issue, and that can be really helpful. And also just is establishing partnerships, building relationships with these stakeholders for the future and for other brownfields development down the line. So depending on if you have kind of a brownfield site in mind, or if you're still trying to identify priority brownfield sites, it could look differently what type of stakeholders you want to involve depending on your point in the process. But some examples of stakeholders could be neighborhood residents and the local youth. It could be community institutions like schools, clinics, and libraries. You could connect with nonprofits, community-based organizations, and even faith-based organizations. It's good to also connect with your state and federal agencies because you always want to ensure proper regulatory compliance as you're going through the process. You'll probably connect with site owners, of course, because they'll need to give you permission to access brownfield sites. Think about urban planners in your community. They're great to help support that visioning process, giving advice on land use, zoning, and designs that align with what your community goals are. And then also developers, because they are going to lead that physical component of the redevelopment. So we always like to mention it's important to identify a project champion. And this person is going to be the one who is leading this whole process of brownfields redevelopment, motivating others to engage and push that momentum of the project forward. So you're really going to want to start thinking about who your project champion is going to be for this brownfield project. Maybe it's going to be you. Next slide. So now that we've talked about identifying the stakeholders, you're going to want to think about the strategy for engaging these partners. And you really want to consider who you're going to be bringing to the table and making sure that table is going to accommodate everybody that's invited. Does your community like to use social media? Do they connect better online? Do you have Facebook groups you can get in touch with? Or maybe your community, they like to read the newspaper. They like to walk up to the local bulletin board in your town and see what's going on. There's no one correct way to begin engagement as long as it's tailored to the stakeholders that you've identified and the constituents that they represent. And so once you've come up with your strategy and you do your initial outreach, you're going to want to heavily consider who your audience is. So it's really important to spread awareness and education about the brownfield that you're looking to redevelop without eliciting fear among the public. And so that can look like a variety of different things. Some examples are having listening sessions where you're practicing active listening to your community members, trying to remain as transparent as possible throughout the process to build that trust, and then incorporating community input as much as you can in the visioning and reuse and cleanup of the site. And then you're also going to want to check and make sure that the work you're proposing or the reuse you're thinking of really aligns with the goals and priorities of your community and of the stakeholders you're involving. Awesome. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so next we're going to dive a little bit more into what it looks like to develop a brownfields inventory and how do you select sites and prioritize those sites in your inventory. Next slide. So what even is a brownfields inventory? To put it simply, it's a catalog of properties that meet the definition of a brownfield site and their associated attributes and the data and information associated with them. So a lot of times we see this in the form of a spreadsheet, but it could be a Word document. The format doesn't necessarily matter as long as you have as much info as you can about the brownfield site and that information stays current and relevant. So even if you don't yet have any specific sites in mind that could be good places for brownfields redevelopment, it's important that you start this inventory process, even if it's just one site at a time, because you really want to build a list that you can come back to when you're looking for more opportunities for redevelopment in your community. And if you don't have really an idea of where to start, think about a target area. Think back to the examples that Devin showed us. In old industrial places, old dry cleaners, abandoned gas stations, vacant lots. Just maybe there's an area of your community that has more of these than a different area. Start there. That could be your target area. And the very beginning of the inventory really starts with just gathering this information. So you can look at public databases, your records in your town hall, just using different sources of data to identify where underused sites might be and what the historic land uses were on those sites. And then, of course, you're going to want to double check that these sites meet the definition of a brownfield. But if there's perceived contamination, then likely it does meet the definition. And you'll also want to make sure you're recording this data that you find. One tool that I recently learned about is called Lightbox, and they produce environmental data reports, which is like a big report that combines historical maps and historical data, and they put that together in a report for you. So that's one tool you might look into when you're gathering info for your brownfields inventory. The next piece to this would be to do a windshield survey, which is literally pulling up to the site in your vehicle or your company vehicle, and what do you see? Take photos, document your observations. Are there buildings on the site? Is there leftover concrete from demolished buildings? Like, what do you see? What do you observe? And do some ground truthing. And ground truthing is the way we say, verify the accuracy of the data that you've gotten. So if you've gotten data that says, hey, there's a building on the site, and you pull up and there's no building, note that in your records. And then lastly, it's just compiling all the information, putting it in your spreadsheet, making it usable and for you and for others who might need to access it, and then consider mapping the sites that you identified, and potentially even publishing this for transparency so the public can see, hey, these are where there are brownfields in our community. And one other thing I wanted to mention before we go to the next slide is that you want to be thinking about one or more priority sites to start with. And as you know, redeveloping brownfields, it takes time and it takes money. And so thinking about which site will have the biggest impact if cleaned up is really important. Or maybe there's one site in particular that's really close to a neighborhood or a school, and maybe that's your priority. Or maybe there's a site that would be an ideal location for affordable housing units, so maybe that's your priority. It really will just depend on input from your community, from your stakeholders, from your general plans in the city, for example. So just be thinking about a priority site as well when you're putting together your inventory. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so you've made your inventory, you've picked your priority site, now you're ready to begin doing the evaluations of the environmental conditions on that site. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Next slide, thank you. So these evaluations are called environmental site assessments, or ESAs. We have a lot of acronyms here at EPA, so you might want to write this down in your dictionary of acronyms. But there are two types of ESAs, a phase 1 and a phase 2. A phase 1 environmental site assessment, also known as all appropriative inquiries, also referred to as doing your due diligence, is similar to the windshield study, as in this is a desk review or a data review of past uses on the site. So this is how you're going to identify recognized environmental conditions based on the property's historic and current uses. So it could consist of doing interviews with local community members that are nearby the site, doing historical document reviews, looking at regulatory databases, doing a site visit, another windshield survey, seeing the observations on the site, taking and sharing photographs, looking at old photographs. This is just kind of to give you an idea of what contamination you may expect based on the historical use of the site. One thing that I want to mention is if there is property transfer going to be involved in your brownfields redevelopment project, the timing of the phase 1 AAI becomes really important, because when you're doing a property transfer, phase 1's required within 180 days of that purchase, so that you're not also assuming the liability for the contamination when you are receiving the property. So if that is a factor in your redevelopment process, just make sure to keep that in mind with your schedule of when you plan to do the phase 1. So once the phase 1 is complete, if you do identify any RECs, then the next step is to move on to the phase 2 environmental site assessment, where the actual sampling for contamination will occur. This is typically done by a qualified engineering professional or a contractor that you might bring onto your team. But here, Under the phase 2, this is where you're going to investigate the wrecks, confirm the presence or absence of contamination with sampling, whether that be in the soil air, soil gas, the groundwater, and the surface water. So someone will come in, take the samples, take them back to the lab, analyze them, see what's there, how much of it, and then the next step would to be figure out what you're going to do to address this contamination. So once you have those results, the next step is going to be to evaluate and interpret them. Is there any additional sampling that's going to be needed? What are your options for cleanup given the results? How clean does it need to be? Does it need to be cleaned up to commercial standards, to residential standards? And that's going to depend on what your reuse is posed to be. And will there need to be any land restrictions put in place? It's very important to clearly define the extent of the contamination during this step because it's going to be the foundation for developing your cleanup plan to address that contamination and for informing the community about the restrictions at the site and to advise the reuse visioning of the site. Next slide. Okay, I am going to pass it on to Stephanie to talk about reuse planning.
Thank you, Brooklyn. Yes, so this step of the process may come sooner, may come at this point, but conducting reuse planning and visioning is key to any brownfields redevelopment project you're considering taking on. This is where you're asking, what does the future actually hold for this property and for our community? What are you working towards? What is the ultimate end use and how is that going to impact the community? So reuse planning and visioning means you're looking at analysis, the assessments that Brooklyn just mentioned, and developing a reuse plan. Next slide. And part of that is visioning and goal setting. It's really important to have a North Star that you're working towards, which will guide every step from planning to cleanup to ultimate redevelopment. And another thing we want to emphasize is that it's equally important that your planning and visioning is something that your community is excited about, that your stakeholders are involved in, and that you have, buy-in from the people who will ultimately be impacted by the work that happens on this property. Having buy-in from the community makes things go smoother, makes your project more successful, and just ultimately will help every step of the redevelopment process. And there are lots of ways to figure out, what redevelopment is going to look like in your community, from visioning sessions to brainstorming with stakeholders, including, entities like community-based organizations, regional planning commissions, metropolitan planning organizations, or councils of government, and looking at all of your options. So we really want to emphasize that, having a vision is really important for even when you still have empty lots and haven't even started addressing brownfields. Knowing what you're working towards will really help make for smoother processes. All right, next slide. And then the last step is implementation. This is probably what you thought you were going to hear about 10 minutes ago, but we really want to emphasize that, before shovels go into the dirt, it is important to have a team, to have your inventory, to have your site assessments, to have that vision and that ultimate North Star of what you're working towards before, you start actually developing the strategy, the cleanup, the reuse, and looking for funding. And again, getting shovels in dirt. Next step. Okay, so we have another poll here. Have you received an EPA Brownfield grant before? Our options are, yes, my organization has received a grant. My organization has partnered with a grant recipient, or no, my organization has not received a grant. We'll see the distribution here. Roll in. And if you lost that link, Devin had it in the chat. All right, so you have lots of organizations that have received EPA Brownfields grants before. That's awesome. Then also some partners. Very cool. Well, it sounds like you all have different kinds of experience with EPA Brownfields grants, but we'll get into it a little bit more. Awesome to see that many of you have received grants in the past. Many of you, the majority of you, but lots haven't as well. Cool. All right, looks like it's stabilized, Devin. So should we move to the next slide? So here's a quick overview on EPA funding sources for brownfield redevelopment. We'll get into the nitty-gritty details of EPA funding in another webinar in this Vacant to Vibrant series, but I'll just give a quick overview of some of the EPA resources that are available. So on the left side, we have in the gray boxes, targeted brownfield assessments, or TBA. This is a way that EPA supports redevelopment efforts. We'll talk about it a little bit more in 2 slides, but this is separate from our grant program. And so our grants that we provide are called multipurpose assessment, revolving loan fund, and cleanup or MARC grants. This is part of our competitive grant program. The applications for the next batch of grants are expected to open in the fall, but this is probably what you've heard of when you heard of EPA funding that's provided. EPA also has other brownfield programs, including our job training program, and those are separate kinds of grants, but these competitive grants are what we provide to communities who are looking to do cleanup assessments, work on brownfields in their communities. And through all of our programs at EPA, we're really focused on investing in communities, helping local leaders, probably like yourselves, to transform brownfield sites into community assets, to promote economic and community development across the country, and to support state and tribal response programs. So in addition to all of these EPA resources, we do want to emphasize that it's not just us doing this work in communities. We're working with the grantees or the recipients of EPA funding or technical assistance. And then also the states and tribes are involved as they're the ones setting cleanup standards, developing environmental policies, and overseeing and approving site cleanup and reuse decisions. All right, next slide. So this is a slide that shows a table with the distribution of grants that EPA awarded in fiscal year 2025 nationwide. So one slightly confusing thing about this slide is that you might not see multi-purpose grants on here. That's because EPA alternates generally or historically has alternated every other year between offering multi-purpose grants and revolving loan fund grants. So we did not award any multi-purpose grants in fiscal year 2025. But this shows you the breakdown nationwide of the kinds of amounts that we offer for each of these grant types, the number of awards nationwide, and sort of the budgets or the funding that was available. So one thing you'll note is that bipartisan infrastructure law funds were part of the awards in fiscal year 2025, and they will be again, we expect, in 2026. But that will be the last year that bill funding is available. One thing to note about bill funding is it increased dollar amounts for grants. There's no cost share for those types of grants, and there's just a bigger pot of money in general. So that is one advantage to having bill funding available. But another thing I wanted to emphasize on this slide is, we are in a time of transition, and there's a degree of uncertainty with a lot of federal funding. We hear that from current recipients, we hear that from communities, and we understand that that's a little bit uncomfortable. But we at EPA Region 9, and that certainly Devin with CCLR, are committed to being as transparent as possible. So if you have questions or concerns, if we have information that we can share, we want this to be an open door where we're able to communicate about what's the latest and greatest, since things are changing pretty quickly. But yeah, at the moment, this is what we know about this last year's funding, and we're looking forward to hopefully awarding more in fiscal year 2026. And then next slide. So I'd mentioned earlier, we also have targeted brownfields assessments, or TBAs, in addition to our grant giving. So if you apply for a TBA project and your project is accepted, how this works is an EPA contractor will provide services to help with assessment and outreach efforts for brownfields in your community. These are generally accepted on a rolling basis, although at the moment we are working on a new contract, so project start dates are a little bit TBD, but we would love to see more applications and support targeted brownfields assessments in your communities. The nice thing about this is it's free and it's perfect for entities or organizations who maybe don't have the capacity to manage or apply for competitive grants that we were talking about on the previous slide, but are still excited to get started with brownfields, addressing brownfields in your community. All right, next slide. So one thing that we love to emphasize is that in general, brownfields funding from EPA or brownfields technical assistance or support is probably not going to be the only source of funding that you are accessing for brownfields redevelopment, and usually can be leveraged and layered with other sources of funding at the local, state, and federal level. So here are just a couple of examples. Something that we see pretty commonly is entities or organizations using brownfields funding to assess or clean up properties in their community, but also using community development block grants or CDBG funds from HUD to support reuse efforts. But there are many different programs, and CCLR and EPA are happy to talk more about what that might look like in your community. All right, I think that's it for me, so I'll pass it back to Devin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Brooklyn, for that great overview. Okay, so we're going to do another Menti question. I would love to ask all of you, after we kind of go through all of that information on Brownfield's basics or kind of the Brownfield process and funding, I'm curious to hear, what are your fears or challenges that you face when considering a land reuse project in your community? This is an open-ended question on Menti. The link to join is in the chat. So we can kind of watch as your open-ended question or answers come in. If talking about, any aspect of fears or challenges that you face when you consider a land reuse project in your community. So I'm seeing that funding is coming up. That is not surprising. Funding can feel like a really huge mountain to climb. Community involvement, losing momentum, releasing harmful toxics that could cause serious health issues, land fractionation on tribal lands. That's very great to put down. That makes sense to be thinking about. Lack of resources. It'll take more time. So capacity issues, misconceptions about brownfields, apathy from the community, thinking about what to put on the property, worries or fears about gentrification or lack of community participation, tribal checkerboarding again, liability, limited staff or technical expertise, ownership complications, data trust and divergent reuse goals. Yes. Insufficient funds. So I'm seeing a lot around funding, community engagement, trust, relationships with owners, liability, fear about contamination, demolition, tribal concerns and engagement. Thank you all for sharing your fears and challenges that you face in your projects. It's very great to hear, what's going on, what are concerns for you, because this is really a big effort to meet you where you're at, hear your challenges, concerns, and work with you one-on-one and specifically addressing those challenges with unique solutions tailored to you by working with CCLR and EPA. So, okay, it looks like we're slowing down a little bit. Okay, I see more staff capacity, funding, community awareness, disinvestment in communities of color is definitely a concern for neighborhood revitalization. Okay, yeah, thank you all so much for your contributions, sharing what are concerns to you. It's really important, to talk through these challenges, issues, and work on them together. So I really appreciate you all sharing. So I tried to cleverly position that question right ahead of this slide where I talk about our technical assistance providers. Um, to say that these are the folks that are ready to help, as well as our team at EPA Region 9 and the Vacant and Vibrant program. So as I said, CCLR is your tab provider for Region 9, and we're also working closely with EPA on this initiative. But we're also part of a larger network of tab providers across the country. So each EPA region has a tab provider. And just in case anyone in here in this webinar today is not in Region 9, I wanted to include that this tab program is nationwide, and you can still reach out to CCLR and we can get you in touch with your specific tab provider. I would also like to ask for another poll, and this should be our last poll. And then we'll get an opportunity to engage with any questions at the end from you all. But I would like to, after following up on talking about your challenges, fears, concerns, I would also like to ask, what are you curious to explore in our next webinar? So this is the first of 3 sessions. Today we kind of did a dive into Brownfield basics. Our next session will be focused on community engagement and project planning and visioning that Stephanie briefly touched on. And our third session will cover funding. And this will also be right before the EPA Brownfield grants come out in the fall time. So we would really like to hear your thoughts on what you would most like to see in our next session, what's most important to you. And even if you put some topics in here that we, might not be able to cover in our next sessions, it's really important for us to hear this so we can tailor future programming to these needs or interests of you all. So feel free to get as specific as you'd like. We're always looking for, what you would like to hear about. Okay, so I see some ideas coming in. Connecting with other entities who have been successfully funded, absolutely. Engaging commercial lenders in brownfield redevelopment, acres reporting, so grant management, best practices for getting local property owners involved. So sharing success stories. So we're talking on the side also of community engagement, partnership engagement, generating community interest, funding, and building partnerships. Opportunity zone collaborations, that's an interesting one, as we might see opportunity zones become more of a focus. Exploring geographic aspects of soil, that's very interesting. So talking about soil science. Creative redevelopment ideas, we could even talk about adaptive reuse. What comes after getting the grant? Absolutely, that can be part of our funding conversation, what to do next. How to prioritize sites when you have hundreds to choose from. So that's part of our Brownfields inventory process. How do we know which sites to focus on? How to apply for Brownfield funding? Absolutely, we'll touch on that. Technical terms. How do you get buy-in from the community? Position this as a part of community wealth building. That's wonderful, especially when we're talking about anti-displacement measures and preventing gentrification, community wealth building, like inputting affordable housing, rent control programs like that can be a key part of reuse planning. How to navigate common hurdles like ownership issues and a lack of community response. That is a big issue that we see in this work. So that makes sense. We can definitely talk about that. Building community awareness and educational materials. A remediation action plan. Awesome. So it's really great to hear from all of you what you're curious to explore further. We're definitely already planning on touching on a lot of these issues, but it's great to know where to focus our kind of training resources, and also encouraging you to meet with us one-on-one to talk about your specific programs, because these are issues that our EPA and CCLR teams are definitely excited to work with you all on. Ownership issues, tribal projects on trust land. Awesome. Okay, so I'll go to our next slide. And it's this slide again, so I'm emphasizing yet again, meet with us, connect with us as your first partners in land reuse. This webinar is our outstretched hand to you. So if you're new to land reuse or you want to talk about the goals of your community right now, please reach out to us with this QR code. And here are some further ways to connect with us in person. So come say hello to the CCLR team and the EPA team in person. We're hosting 2 workshops in California this year. On June 3rd, we'll be hosting a workshop in Sacramento, and on June 5th in Fresno. So during these workshops, which both of them will be pretty similar to each other, so it's all right if you can only make it to one. But we will be going on tours of brownfield sites. We'll dive into the assessment and cleanup process, and we'll also work through some real life case studies to sharpen your skills in land reuse. CCLR and EPA are also hosting another year of the California Land Recycling Conference. So you can join us in Carson, California on September 16th through 18th to engage with some great speakers at the conference and connect with our teams there as well. And each of these events, even though it says, California big on the slide, each of these events are open to all states within Region 9. So you'll find very useful, relevant information and case studies to bring back to your work, even if you are outside of Region 9. And I will also share a link to these events in the chat, as well as we really encourage you to sign up to our newsletter so that you don't miss any further announcements regarding upcoming events or announcements regarding funding opportunities and things like that. It's a really great resource to stay updated with our newsletter. Okay, so finally, you can contact the Vacant to Vibrant team individually. So you can contact the 3 of us individually instead of scheduling a meeting. If you would, rather not schedule a meeting with us, or if you just have a quick question that you'd like to ask following this webinar, you can absolutely email one or all of us, and we'll get back to you as well. And I'll put our contact information in the chat again while we go through our Q&A portion, just so that you have our emails there. All right, so now we can go ahead and get into any questions that you all have. So I know that we have some questions in the Q&A, or I think they might have been answered. But I will go ahead and read the questions that have been answered, just so that everyone can hear them in case others have the same question. So someone asked, is the revolving loan fund considered a grant? And Brooklyn answered, yes, the revolving loan fund is considered a grant. The entity is applying would be the one to administer subgrants or low interest loans to other organizations to perform brownfield cleanups. Brooklyn, Lisa, or Stephanie, any other comment on the RLF revolving loan fund?
Just that we offered the revolving loan fund as part of the grants competition for FY25, and it will likely not be offered for FY26. As Stephanie mentioned earlier, we alternate between multi-purpose grants and revolving loan fund grants. So we don't anticipate the next notice of funding opportunity for RLFs until FY27.
Awesome, thank you, Lisa. Okay, so another question was, what makes a TBA assessment grant more competitive? And Brooklyn responded, the Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program is not considered a grant, but it is free technical assistance, and it's a non-competitive application process. Would anyone like to add on to that or talk about the TBA program a little bit more?
I'll be happy to talk about that. We love the TVA program because our team at EPA Region 9 can make a decision about projects that we think are a good fit. And it's easy for folks to apply. You don't have to go through a grants competition or anything. It's a simple online application. You don't even have to dot all your I's and cross all your T's because we'll reach out to you if there's information missing and we'll ask you questions. Um, the one downside is that we have limited funding in a lot of sites, so it's not like we could assess many sites or huge sites, but we have had additional funding because of the bipartisan infrastructure law for the last couple of years. And so we've been able to do larger projects. The other really great thing about the targeted brownfields assessment um, program is that at the end of a project, we'll generate an analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives, which is an evaluation of what sort of cleanup methods may be appropriate for a site that needs to have the contamination addressed to support the anticipated reuse. Just it looks at cost, implementability, and effectiveness of various possible options. And that is something that needs to be attached to a cleanup grant application. So if you time things right, we can do a targeted brownfields assessment for you through our contractor, and then you'll be positioned so that you can apply for a cleanup grant. I don't know if there's anything else you all think I should add to that, or if there are other questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Lisa. I really appreciate that. So a question did come up in the chat, but just so we don't miss any questions, if you put a question in the chat previously, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box as well, just to make sure we don't miss anything. But how does site ownership or lack thereof impact the TBA? So maybe Lisa or Brooklyn or Stephanie could take on that one.
Yes, that's a really good question. You do not need to own the site in order to apply for a clean or a targeted brownfields assessment. Um, we can assess as long as there's some sort of a community benefit and there's a sponsor for the site. So it could potentially even be a private site if one of the three types of organizations, including units of government, 501(c)(3) nonprofits, or tribes are willing to sponsor an application and the ultimate reuse will have some sort of a community benefit, we could do a targeted brownfields assessment on a private property as long as we have access consent from the owner. So no ownership requirement as long as we can get access from the property owner. We have a signed access consent form that is on our website with the application, and we ask that applicants submit the access consent at the time they submit the application. So we won't even consider your project unless you give us the access consent with the application.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. Okay, another question is what part of local government typically applies for the different grants available? R&D, housing, community development, which parts of local government?
I would say all of the above. We see all kinds of different units within local government applying, and sometimes in the same cycle. I mean, as long as one organization needs to apply, you can't apply in the same competition. But if there's sort of a legal separation, it would be possible for two parts of the government to apply, and certainly in consecutive years.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. Okay, another question. It sounded like perceived contamination of a site is enough to qualify it as a brownfield, but it sounded later like further data was needed to prove it is contaminated. Is perceived contamination enough to qualify, or is proof needed to qualify? Lisa, do you want to take on that question as well? Maybe expand on
Yeah,
it
no,
too,
that's a
because
really good question. And that actually is, as long as there's a perception, as long as there's some sort of reason to believe that there may be contamination hindering reuse, or the other thing is if you just don't know.
A lot of times there's just a site sitting there. There's not a lot of historical information about what happened. And so the Brownfields funding could be used to initiate.
Oh, you are on mute all of a sudden, Lisa.
Sorry. I don't know how long was I on mute?
Just a few seconds.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So as long as until the time at which there is contamination disproven, it would remain a brownfield site. So unless there, you go to the extent of conducting a phase 2 assessment, which would involve data collection, if that assessment came back and showed that there was no contamination, which would be great, we wouldn't consider it a brownfield site, or until there's a cleanup completed. But there's no requirement, there's proof. Although if you apply for a cleanup grant, you do need to demonstrate that there's contamination there.
Yeah, and that'll come from the phase 1, phase 2 assessment. Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, another question. Can state hospitals apply for brownfield grants?
I want to say probably, but we would really need to take a look at how the organization is structured to confirm. So I would say on a site-specific basis, before you go to the trouble to put together an application for any sort of a Brownfields grant, reach out to us and we can vet the site because it's very site-specific. And without knowing more about the organization, I don't want to say yes or no.
Thank you, Lisa. All right. Okay, another question. Have private entities applied for brownfield assistance? I think this also can be a question of if private entities are eligible for brownfield assistance.
Yes. So there are some opportunities. So across the board, no. Across the board, Brownfields funding in general is accessible to units of government, 501c3 nonprofits, and tribes. However, private entities can access Brownfields funding. For example, if one of those eligible entities has an assessment grant, they can use the funding to do assessments on private properties. Through the Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program, if there is a private property and one of those eligible entities is willing to sponsor an application, if there's some sort of eventual reuse that will be beneficial to the community, a private entity could get that support. And then the third way is through our revolving loan fund grant program. The grant recipients can make loans to private entities. But a private entity in and of itself could not apply directly for a Brownfields grant or technical assistance.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. I see another question. Is there an official EPA template for when we conduct the ESAs, or is the formatting up to us? So I think that depends on if you're using TBA or Mark Brownfield's grants.
Well, the key is that the assessments need to conform with the ASTM standards for phase 1 and phase 2 assessments. So it's really looking at the contents versus the format.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to answer more detailed question if you have one offline.
Yeah, I think we can stay pretty, high level summary answers. That's great, Lisa. And if you have a more specific question, or I see Michelle, you have a question about drawdown requirements for the grants available this fall. There are resources and webinars currently going on from National Tab, and also we'd love to talk specifically with you about your concerns about making the 70% drawdown requirement absolutely for the coalition assessment grants. We'd love to have a conversation with you offline to connect on that and work through your specific concerns.
Glad you're thinking about it, because you're absolutely right that there will be, in all likelihood, some sort of drawdown requirement, and there's always a date, usually a date in October, for example, by which the grant needs to be drawn down. So definitely good to plan in advance so that you don't get kicked out of the pool.
Yeah, I think that goes along with just the broader message of starting on EPA Brownfields grants or funding opportunities. Starting early is the best thing. So we will have our funding webinar on available funding in 2 months. But there are also current resources available. There was a webinar on May 1st from National TAP that went over MARC funding that is going to be offered this year. So I can also send some of those resources for MARC funding in the follow-up email for this webinar, since I know that that can be, a big daunting thing for folks.
And let me just chime in to say that we actually do check. So if the requirement's 70%, you can't have spent down 69.5%. You really will not be eligible to apply.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so the last question that I see here, if contamination is identified, is there a requirement or obligation to address it?
We at EPA, we're not an enforcement program. And so it's really up to the property owner to work with whichever, maybe state or local regulatory oversight authority would be the one making a determination on cleanup. So we're merely providing technical assistance and funding to help.
Yes. All right, thank you so much. I don't see any other questions in our Q&A box or in the chat. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and reach out to us at the emails listed here. Or of course, please reach out to us to schedule a one-on-one meeting as part of the Vacant Vibrant program. We're really excited about connecting with communities that are new to Brownfields and building that relationship there. Even if you do not have a Brownfield project in mind at the moment, that's not necessarily the point of the call, but more so to get to know you, get to know your community goals, understand what issues you're facing, and really be a partner to you in developing projects and in working on your goals for your communities. And so with that, we can close out the webinar. Again, thank you so much to Brooklyn, Stephanie, and Lisa for joining and sharing information. And thank you to everyone who took time out of your day to spend it with us. And we really look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which is going to be on June 11th at the same time. If you registered for this webinar, it's going to be the same registration. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for participating.